Welcome to the Talk BD podcast, where we break down the science and strategies to live well with bipolar disorder.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Emma Morton, and today I'm bringing you another bonus Crest BD interview, updating you about the latest on research for psychedelic therapies for bipolar disorder. And today I have the distinct pleasure of speaking to Meghan DellaCrosse, a pre-doctoral intern and researcher at the Early Psychosis Intervention Center at The Ohio State University, and a close collaborator of Dr. Josh Woolley's Translational Psychedelic Research program at the University of California, San Francisco. So thank you for joining us today, Meghan. And as a qualitative researcher and therapist myself, I am so excited and enthusiastic to hear what you have to say about today's topic. So to get us started, I'd love to hear more about your role as well as how you became interested in psilocybin research.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with you as well. So just a little bit on my role. So basically right now I'm finishing up my doctoral work. I'll graduate at the end of the year. And so as a psychologist, we have to go through the clinical training process with the ending project, so to say, finishing your dissertation and doing internship. So I'm currently on internship at The Ohio State University, where I'm working as a clinician and also have protected research time as well. And so in this context, I'm enjoying, learning more about working with individuals with psychotic spectrum disorders. I also have a secondary rotation working with individuals with mood disorders, specifically using mindfulness-based interventions. So really enjoying that. And then using some of my research time working with Dr. Alan Davis, who's affiliated with the Center for Psychedelic Drug Research and Education here at OSU. And so working on some different projects there. But to your question of, how I got involved with psilocybin research. So I think it's maybe important to note is that my background prior to becoming on the pathway to become a psychologist, I was actually working in the art world for a while, both as a curator as well as doing more art historical kind of scholarly research specific to 1960s performance art. So in that context, I was really curious about concepts of embodiment, experiential learning, things that were really influential to artistic practice at that time. And so some of the artists that I was writing about, they were students of the composer John Cage. Many of them were influenced by different types of meditation that was coming to the US at that time. Also kind of emergent kind of practices related to somatics. So I began, writing about that more as a researcher in that context. But it led me to study some of those things and actually pursue training. I'm a qualified mindfulness-based stress reduction instructor at this point. So really curious about these different, areas of research and feeling like maybe the art world wasn't really like the best place for me to continue pursuing those interests. So I transitioned to the field of clinical psychology, really interested in engaging in different types of research involving the mind-body connection. So, time passed and more training passed. And then eventually I, as a part of my clinical training for my doctoral program, we had a match process and I got connected with Dr. Josh Woolley at UCSF, originally also working with Dr. Connie Ludwig as well, to learn different assessments for specifically working with people with serious mental illness. And at that point, I knew that Josh was also engaged in different types of research on psychedelics. So let him know that I was curious about it. And, Dr. Woolley is really, as a mentor, he's really enthusiastic and really wants to encourage his mentees to explore and really learn as much as possible. So in that context, I was able to start working as a clinical assessor for the Wright Institute sponsored study of major depressive disorder, psilocybin for major depressive disorder. And so in that context, I really, got hooked on working on clinical trials. I think it's really such an interesting opportunity to learn about, different ways that people are coming in with certain symptoms and learning about the effects of certain, drugs, in this case, psilocybin, really feeling inspired by the ways that people seem to be really changed by some of these treatments. And so, at this point, we have collaborated on this project looking at psilocybin for bipolar disorder, bipolar depression. And yeah, I think I'm just going to take a pause for there now and see if I've missed anything.
No, that's fascinating. I've actually never heard some of those parts of your background. I never knew that you had that connection to the art world. And now there's a totally different conversation that I want to have about like psilocybin and the relationship perhaps to creativity in bipolar disorder. So I'm just going to put a pin in that idea because now I see all of these new avenues of discussion. But yeah, I'm really interested in that. And I think that gives you a really unique lens about some of the, mystical and those experiences that people have and what that might bring to the role as a qualitative researcher. So a really big question to start us off, but from your perspective, what are some of the big unanswered questions in psilocybin research?
Yeah, well, I think that this is really a tough question. I think, given the ways that there's so much media hype around psychedelic research at this point, it almost makes you think, that it's like ready for widespread application, which of course it's not. There's still so much research to be done. I think like first and foremost, I think that a really important unanswered question, particular to the context of our conversation, is really where certain exclusion criteria for individuals with bipolar disorder, as well as individuals with schizophrenia or a family history of those conditions, have been excluded from the research. And so at this point, as we're looking, to the future to see how these treatments might be applied more widely at a future date, I think that those gaps in the literature in terms of safety and risk for certain people, I think that's something that's really important. And I think that, even in the context of the clinical work that I'm doing this year at OSU, I think, there's been times that I was working on the inpatient unit, and really coming into contact with ways that, there are certain risks for certain individuals, using certain substances. And I think that, there still is a lot of research to be done in that area. I think that in some cases, on one hand, there may be more risks for certain people. And so people that are maybe working in the context of research on serious mental illness may be more accustomed to seeing those types of risks kind of unfolding like in clinical settings. Whereas on the other hand, I think that a lot of psychedelic research is really needing to demonstrate safety for the purpose of, overcoming FDA approval and these types of things. But I really feel like these two conversations, I feel like we have a lot to learn from each other. Another unanswered question that I often find myself thinking about is really in the context of the therapeutic component. Like a lot of people are looking at, oh, what about psilocybin, as like the drug component. And it's also, people that are participating in clinical trials are experiencing a substantial amount of therapy. And yet I feel like there's so much more nuance about the kind of mechanisms of change that have yet to be explored. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing more of that research happen, specifically clinician researchers that are really invested in being therapists and really starting to ask new questions about that. Because I think at this point, so much is focused on symptom reduction and drug effect. And yet there's a lot of other things that are happening at the same time. So.
Yeah, those are really interesting points. I agree. Part of the reason we're having this series of conversations with researchers in the psychedelics and psilocybin space is that, there is one particular version of the story that's being hyped up in media reports. And I think, if you got me, David, Josh, yourself in a room, we'd all say we're really excited about the potential, but, we have to balance that with some cautions at the same time. And the more we can do to figure out precisely how to balance those risks with the potential of this substance, the safer it'll be for us to proceed forward as a field. And definitely, there's been a lot of interest in the physiological impacts of psilocybin as a potential influence on serotonin receptors, which probably everyone's heard a lot about. the theorized links between that and depression, as you're saying, there's this big unexplained side about the therapy that occurs. We're talking psilocybin-based therapies, and what exactly is that piece of the puzzle? I'm excited to talk to you more about today.
Yeah. Thank you.
So you and I and a broader group of investigators collaborated on a qualitative follow-up study of people living with bipolar disorder who had experiences of using psilocybin. And just to give a little bit of additional context to that study, for those of you who have listened to an earlier episode, you may have heard Josh and myself talking about a survey that we conducted asking people who have used psilocybin about their experiences of the benefits as well as the potential risks. And to follow up in more detail, Meghan and our collaborator Molly Pleat contacted people and asked for more in-depth material about their experiences using qualitative research. So that might not be a term that listeners are familiar with. So Meghan, can you tell us more about qualitative research and how it can help us better understand the experience of psilocybin use?
I think in short, qualitative research provides methods of analysis that allow us to deepen our understanding of things, especially important in the context of understudied areas. And so whereas quantitative research may be more helpful in more close-ended questions, also just, learning different ways of quantifying people's experiences and symptoms and that type of thing, qualitative research allows us to kind of open up things, allowing us to explore in more detail variability across people's experiences. I think in the context of psilocybin research, qualitative research is really helpful for helping to understand contextual pieces of people's experiences that we might not necessarily know to ask a specific question about that. So it allows us to kind of open things up. I believe, as I said earlier, or perhaps at another time, Alex Beltzer, another psychedelic researcher, he has this way of describing qualitative research as more of hypothesis generating than hypothesis answering, which I think is just really important for where we are with psychedelic research at this point. And I think that, the survey that you all conducted first before the interviews were done, really helped us to gain a preliminary understanding of what it is that we might need to, guide our attention toward.
I think that's a great point, that qualitative research is hypothesis generating, and it kind of tells us what questions do we need to ask, and in some cases, what measures do we need to answer that? We can measure the physiological impacts of psilocybin in some ways, but definitely there are things that people have told us about the, subjective experience of using that substance that isn't necessarily captured by those measures, or sometimes may not even be captured by symptom assessment measures. We know people talk about mystical experiences and existential realizations. And, in some cases, I think we even need to come up with the quantitative measures that can then assess that in a larger sample based on these kind of qualitative reports. So it's a really fundamental and important step to do this kind of work to allow us to move forward with those bigger, large scale samples. So Meghan, can you tell us more about what you found in your qualitative analyses? Was psilocybin use harmful or beneficial for those participants?
Something that's important just to mention before answering that question is really just looking at the ways that we are approaching this qualitative analysis. So in this case, we're using thematic analysis, which can be particularly useful for just getting a lay of the land, as they say, rather than, really specifically looking to see how many instances may have occurred. We're really just trying to get a sense of what was the broader experience that people were describing. And so as Brown and Clark have described, reflexive thematic analysis is really allowing the analysis itself to be guided by the participants' voices. So we're never really allowing our own questions as researchers to be too dominant. We're really allowing the participants' voices to shine. And so in doing so, we really noticed that people were describing both challenging experiences that they would, qualify as harmful, and they were also reporting benefits. So as far as like the overall themes that we developed in this first paper, we were looking at mental health improvements that people were describing. We are looking at undesired mental health impacts. And then we are also looking at the contextual factors of both beneficial and adverse psilocybin experiences. And so within each of those different themes, we found some really interesting sub-themes as well. For example, in the mental health improvements that people were describing, some people were reporting decreased impact and severity of depression symptoms. So in some cases, just noticing that, it was a significant change for them that they noted as positive. In other cases, under mental health improvements, people were describing things like increased emotion processing. And so, the ways that the psilocybin experience itself allowed them to confront certain emotional experiences that maybe they had held themselves back from previously. I remember in particular, there was one participant that said that they felt that they no longer had to police their feelings. And they were, citing that as something that was really beneficial for them. Another thing that I think, you never really want to have favorites, but I think something that I just found particularly interesting within this broader theme of improvements were the new perspectives that people were describing. In some cases, some even still having symptoms of depression, but relating to their symptoms in new ways, feeling less, burdened by these symptoms and really kind of looking at it with a new perspective. And then the last sub-theme from that particular category was, people describing things like greater relaxation and sleep, which in our case, we found this surprising because we were anticipating that sleep, may be something that would have been reported, as a more adverse experience, which it was. But before I jump ahead, I think that sort of encapsulates the improvements that people were describing. And I think that to reflect on the previous, question about how qualitative research is important here, when we first started doing this study as a whole, we were really looking to see, is this potentially safe for this population, right? And so we were looking for these specific risk and safety factors. And so to find these mental health improvements, I think, was really an interesting finding.
That's really fascinating that you're not just uncovering some of the potential impacts on depressive symptoms, but it sounds like also teasing out some ways the how that actually occurred in terms of decreasing avoidance of those confronting emotions or taking a new perspective. It sounds like there was a really major shift in how people are actually thinking about those symptoms and relating to those symptoms beyond just the symptoms decreasing.
Right. Exactly. Which I think is so interesting.
Yeah. Hypothesis generating indeed.
Exactly. Yeah. But, as I mentioned, there were some, experiences that were described as harmful. As I mentioned before, we sort of developed a theme that was looking more as unwanted mental health impacts. So in some cases, people were reporting changes in sleep. As I mentioned before, some people were experiencing some greater relaxation and improved sleep, whereas there were a number of other people that had disrupted sleep. In some cases, people were describing things like, not being able to fall asleep until well into the next day as one of those examples. And I think something that's kind of interesting within this theme of unwanted mental health impacts is like we can sort of like, it's like kind of an upward trajectory of the kind of intensity of the ways that people were describing these experiences. In some instances, it was more of just agitated sleep. In some cases, it was, really disrupted sleep for, longer than 24 hours. And then next, as a sub-theme within this category is really increased mania severity. And so, in this case, it was really where participants were describing how they felt that, they were experiencing increases in symptoms of, grandiosity, for example, impulsive decision-making, those types of things that are more associated with mania. And kind of, building on this within this theme was experiences of hospitalization. They were relatively uncommon, but I do think that it's important to mention that, this is not without risks for certain individuals.
Yeah, and that certainly parallels some of what we saw in the survey outcomes, that certainly some people did experience disrupted sleep and manic symptoms in that period after, using psilocybin. So it's really interesting to hear how that kind of seemed to occur on that progression like you're talking about, because hopefully that gives us some opportunities to intervene and course correct if someone is having a difficult experience in the context of psilocybin assisted therapy. And, definitely clues us in as therapists working in that field of what to look out for and be cautious for.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And I think just something to add on to that, that the last theme that we developed for this paper was really looking at the different contextual factors. And so I think that this kind of, adds to what you were saying, Emma. But in this case, like we're asking ourselves, right, like if this is safe to do for future research, like what are the contextual factors? And so in this case, we saw instances of people using multiple substances at once, where that was, in some cases, a contextual factor that was described either with a positive or a negative experience, as well as psilocybin dose. So in some cases, where maybe a participant didn't realize how much psilocybin that they had taken, and maybe they only realized too late that they had taken too much, those types of experiences. Another aspect of contextual factors that was really important, again, both for positive and negative experiences, was, more of the social context. So if individuals were taking psilocybin by themselves, if they were taking it in a group, in some cases, like if a person was taking it at a music concert, these were important aspects to people's narratives. And I think that it's important to add that there was a substantial amount of variability within those. In some cases, people said that their experience by themselves was positive because they were by themselves. Whereas other people were, there was one particular participant that we highlighted in our paper that they were by themselves and they felt that that was the reason why they had a negative experience. So I think that this variability really just highlights the need for more research in order to really understand aspects of safety.
Right. Yeah, because, when we're looking at things like the case reports that exist about, negative experiences of psilocybin use, or even our survey, which, asked people just in broad strokes about whether or not they'd experienced any type of symptom escalation afterwards, we only have a really rough idea of what was actually going on for people at that time. And it sounds like your research is highlighting that, when we're generalizing from, self-directed experiences of psilocybin use, it doesn't look like a clinical trial because you don't have a single pill that says exactly how many milligrams you're taking. Right. You're not in a carefully controlled setting in a hospital or a clinic. There are all kinds of intersecting factors with using additional substances, being alone or being around supportive people, or being in an overwhelming environment that can really influence the course of the experience for people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that definitely helps us interpret then those quantitative findings in a way that I think encourages future controlled research, because potentially people's outcomes may be different or safer if we can manage some of those contextual risks.
Right.
Yeah. But just to pull back for a second about, the process of doing this kind of qualitative research. So qualitative studies have relatively small samples compared to quantitative research. So when doing this type of research, how do you make sure that your findings weren't biased towards the opinions of a small group?
Listen, yeah, thank you for asking that. So in this particular study, as we've been discussing, the survey that came in phase 1 for the follow-up interviews that happened in phase 2, we had originally asked, if people were interested in follow-up interviews. And so there were 332 people that agreed to participate in follow-up interviews. And so we used a specific type of sampling, purposive sampling, and contacted 23 specific people that we chose as a means of diversifying the overall sample that we are inviting to participate in interviews. So this was both in terms of demographic details as well as extremely positive and extremely negative experiences. That way we were really, maximizing the number of people that we were, having the interview with versus if that would have been more random. And so, yeah, out of those 23 people, we had 15 people that got back to us about participating. So yeah, thank you for asking that.
Right, because one of the potential issues with doing any kind of research on a perhaps controversial topic that you might have people who are particularly enthusiastic. So it sounds like you were deliberately trying to reach out to people who had those positive experiences as well as people who had experienced adverse outcomes to learn more.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. Before we talk about the implications of this study, was there anything else in your findings that was particularly surprising or unexpected?
One of the things that I found particularly surprising was really the variation in people's reports on sleep. I think that prior to conducting this study, we thought that, sleep may be disrupted. I think that, there's some other literature, in relation to the ways that psilocybin can be disruptive to sleep more generally. And so I think that we were kind of expecting that. And so I think that I found myself very surprised when, certain people were describing like, I was much more relaxed than I usually am. And, that I never slept quite as well as after psilocybin. So I think that was definitely something really surprising. I think another piece that we kind of spoke about a little earlier, in parsing out, as you were saying, the ways that there may have been experiences of decreased symptoms of depression, but really looking at the ways that people experience that. In some cases, it was like this new perspective that allowed them to feel less impacted by their symptoms. So I think that was really both interesting and surprising because I think that it really just highlighted the complexity of, an individual's experience of depression and how, when you're used to living with this day in and day out, it might seem like things are never going to change. And so really like to maybe still have some of those symptoms, but just have a new perspective of the ways that you're relating to that, I think is really huge.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the sleep question is obviously really important for us to figure out in more detail, given what we know about that as a risk factor for episodes for people living with bipolar disorder. But in terms of what you've found out about how people relate to their emotional experiences and how that changes with psilocybin use, I think that's super exciting because one of the things that interests me most about this field is how psilocybin seems to sit at this nexus of pharmacological and psychological interventions in a way that I can't really think of another treatment that does. And it's going to be a really interesting space to work in over the next 5 to 10 years to learn more about how exactly those kinds of interventions can complement one another.
Absolutely.
So, Meghan, how do you think your research might influence future studies of psilocybin-assisted therapy for people with bipolar disorder?
Some of these initial findings, looking at the ways that, there are potential risks and there are potential benefits. I think that, some of the things that we ultimately recommended from our paper, really looking at the ways that, having a really firm support network for an individual participating in a trial, I think could be really important, just given the ways that people were talking about their experiences. So both, in the context of, working closely with a therapist, but also having a supportive other, partner, friend, in participating in a trial. So it would be my hope that some of those things would, perhaps be incorporated. I think some of the other ways that this research could be used to influence future research is really looking at the aspect of polysubstance use for individuals who may have had some sort of challenging experience. Really, hopefully encouraging that to inform future trials as well. And I think, lastly, I think, really just looking at the ways that, as you were saying before, like in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe the intersection of drug and therapeutic process, the ways that those will continue to unfold, hopefully. It's my hope that, some of the things that we were exploring in this paper through some of the people's, experiences, I hope that, perhaps we have generated some hypotheses that might be explored further. I know for sure that I have learned a lot from this initial paper, and, it's really given me a lot to think about.
Yeah, I know some of those safety precautions are being implemented in Josh's clinical trial, looking at the potential impacts, feasibility of psilocybin for bipolar depression, that really involved the individual support person and kind of giving people a lot of cautions around the use of other substances during that trial. So I think, we're already seeing the impacts of your work in making sure that people have a safe or as safe as possible experience. To the latter point that you raised, we've been talking a lot about research today, but of course you are a therapist yourself. So how do you see the role of psilocybin in future treatments for people with mental health difficulties?
In many ways, psilocybin-assisted therapy, it really is a different paradigm than the current model of therapy that we're using. I think even if you just look at the amount of time that is spent for sure, in a clinical trial, it's a certain context. But even, just kind of thinking about the future, I think, therapy sessions are typically 50 minutes to an hour, right? Or if you're in a hospital setting, maybe even more like 30 minutes. So to have a multi-hour session, I think will really start to, bring about other types of challenges, with providing that type of care. But, all of that to say, I hope that, by, providing new types of treatment that seems to be really beneficial for people, it would be my hope that we could start to learn from some of these other types of models to even start to see how we can, I don't know how this might end up kind of upending other things, but I feel curious about that. I think that, as I mentioned before, I really am curious about some of these other mechanisms of change, of increased psychological flexibility and emotion processing. I think that there's so much to explore there as far as how psilocybin therapy may help to, help us to understand more about that. And I think, even from working with the clinical trials with Dr. Woolley, I think just watching the ways that people seem to, of course, when you're working as an assessor on a trial like that, you don't know who has received the study drug or not. And it's interesting, the people that really, at the different time points for the different assessments, it's interesting to see the variation in people who seem to really have had a really positive experience. So yeah, I'm curious to see how that might unfold.
Yeah, I think there's a really important piece that you bring up there, a reminder to all of us who work in this space to kind of balance our enthusiasm about psilocybin with some of those equity and accessibility concerns, because, you are correct that a multi-hour session is going to present specific challenges to people who can't afford to take that time off work or off caring duties. So I think that's a really important point. I'm glad you brought that up, that's something that we need to keep in mind as we develop these treatments to make sure that they are accessible to everyone who might benefit from them. And then certainly, I think you and I are both, just really excited to see the developments that happen in this space, especially around that emotion processing and how people relate to their experiences. I really think that qualitative research has a really significant role to play as we continue this research journey.
Absolutely. 200%. I think that, I think, mixed methods research is really, there's so much to be gleaned from, having both quantitative and qualitative approaches within a study. And I think that, certainly my background as an art historian, I came into qualitative research with a certain set of tools that, I realized that it's a certain bias in a certain way to qualitative research. I don't, I'm not, I believe in mixed methods research, but I think that, finding ways of integrating qualitative research methods in ways that you start the study knowing that you want to have a qualitative component rather than just slapping on a set of open-ended questions at the end. I'm not in favor of that type of mixed methods research. I think that there's just too much to be learned from this process.
There's a way to do that that's purposeful and, respectful of people's time and contributions. That when we collect that data, especially around those open-ended questions, as we've done in the survey, it's, I think, something that's often asked, but isn't always analyzed. And I think, as researchers, we have a responsibility to amplify the stories and the voices that we hear in this kind of work. So mixed methods all the way for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Meghan, thank you so much for your time today and sharing your expertise. I'm really excited to hear about the future directions of this research, and I'm excited to pester you offline with all kinds of ideas for collaboration about art-based therapies and psilocybin, and there's all kinds of research around music playlists in this area. Now I want to work with you about art and explore that in more detail.
Yeah, so, I was actually wondering if we had ever spoken about that before, but now I know.
No, but we're going to now. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone who joined us. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.